Okay, so in the last part, we talked about how excess glucose was made and stored as glycogen, and then this glycogen can be broken down when needed for more glucose. When glycogen levels get too low, the body can also use glycerol, which will be derived from the triglyceride molecule, which brings us to the next organic compounds, lipids. Right, lipids make up about so and so percent of body mass. Right? These includes fatty acids, triglycerides, right? Phospholipids, steroids, and other stuff like these fat-soluble vitamins, all these vitamins, as well as lipoproteins. And so the main thing we want to know as far as this kind of lecture here is they are hydrophobic. Right? This plays an important part in how they form these channels here, as well as how they're transported around the blood, right? Hydrophobic. Right? And that'll also relate to this other kind of mixed molecule here, lipoproteins. So for these fatty acids, right, over here, these long chains of carbons, right, the hydroxyl group here, and then these glycerides, which is one of these with a glycerol molecule attached to it, right? And just, I don't know how much this comes up, but when we talk about saturated versus unsaturated, sometimes instead of a hydrogen molecule right here, you'll have a double bond of carbon, which creates this little bit of a actual physical kink in there, right? And this will play an important part in your phospholipid bilayer, so it's a little bit looser as opposed to saturated when they're all stuck together, right? So fatty acids and glycerides, when you have three of these fatty acid groups connected to this glycerol, you have a triglyceride, right? An important molecule also in energy. So for the important lipids, right? One of the main ones here is this phospholipid, right? The fatty acid tail. The 3-carbon glycerol molecule with the 2 fatty acid chains attached with the other carbon being attached to this phosphate group. And this phosphate group, very hydrophilic, likes water, right? So that it's attracted to the water up here. Extracellular fluid and the water down here of the intracellular fluid. Right? So, and then these, which don't like water, all kind of stick together, right? So that's how this membrane is formed right here. Right? So this is phospholipid, and those little kinks right here is why this isn't like completely rigid. That's your phospholipid. And so here's one of those fatty acids, right? Over here, you can see it's mostly carbon and hydrogen right here with a little tail right here. This is a string, right, a chain of that. Down here, you got this bubble structure right here. This is another type of lipid right here, another big class. These are steroids, right? These ring structures over here. And one of the functions of these is to give a little bit of structure to the cell membrane itself, right? So this over here is a representation of these ringed molecules here, which make up the other important lipid group, steroids. And so these steroids, right, if you look at any of these right over here, they look an awful lot alike. I'm going to give you guys a minute here and see if anybody in the chat or anything tell me the difference between estrogen here, which is the major molecule, right? During puberty, this gives all you secondary sex characteristics of females. It does other things. Testosterone during puberty gives all those secondary sex characteristics, right? But if you look at these two molecules, they look very much the same over here. So who wants to venture? Who can pick out what's different about these two? This little thing right here versus this, number one, right? Instead of having, there's this CH group and the hydroxyl group. It's a little different from the carbonyl group right here. So instead of having this, there's a double bond to the, you lose the hydrogen here. You have a double bond on the oxygen. And this methyl group over here. So you have a double bond over here instead, these two double bonds over here instead, right? So, I mean, it's kind of, they look so much alike, as well as cortisol. They all look very similar, but everybody knows there's this super big difference, right? And that all has to do with the shape and the receptors that receive these molecules, right, that are going to really determine their function. That's just kind of a demonstration of, when you're looking at these chemical structures, you say, oh, there's just a little bit of difference. It's a major difference when you're looking at any of these like slight differences in these steroid molecules. So estrogen, testosterone, right? They're released by the female and male gonads, right? And they produce all these wonderful effects that we know about, right? So this gets into one of the functions of steroids, that they're used as hormones, right? Secreted. This is just a couple examples of them. And the key to this is that they are floating around in the blood, usually maybe sometimes associated with transport proteins. Remember, they're not soluble so much in water. They might be a little soluble, but once released into the blood, they are alleged to go right through the cell membrane, right? Because the cell membrane, small lipid soluble molecules can diffuse through the cell membrane, right? Water soluble hormones are going to act a little differently. And that's what you'll see in the book. I don't know what is being taught these days. I will mention, just in case it comes up in 145, this is like from 20 years ago, but I think that more people think that all those steroid molecules actually don't diffuse through here so readily, but they go through some kind of channel instead, right? That's a red dot moment here. I won't ask you about it, but that's just something that happens, or something that's proposed. All right, so that's steroids. So they were embedded a little bit in your cell membrane, and they're used as, for structure. They give a little structure. The little OH part of this cholesterol here is, kind of makes it head toward the polar end, and then this ends up down in this hydrophilic region, just like your phospholipid bilayer. Phospholipid molecule. But the other class here of lipids are these glycolipids, right? Some of these, which are infused, are stuck in the cell membrane, which will be important in things. I don't think we talk about this, but cell recognition is a major part of glycolipids. But they're part of the cell membrane. But the other conglomeration of lipids is with proteins. And these lipoproteins, right? Since these lipids have to be transported through the blood, but they are not polar molecules, right? To make them more soluble, these lipid molecules are joining up with protein molecules, hydrophilic protein molecules. So you get these complexes that you've probably heard a little about, especially LDL and HDL, right? Low density lipoproteins, high density lipoprotein. These have to do with the ratio of proteins to lipids, right? So you got a little lipid bilayer on the outside, not a bilayer, but a phospholipid layer. And then you got it packed with these triglycerides. Here it's also referred to as triacylglycerides, but most people just use triglycerides. So these are going to carry around fatty acids, basically, and cholesterol around your blood, right over there, right? So these lipoproteins. And again, the hydrophobic stuff, right? This is going to allow it to be dissolved, basically, or carried around in the blood because of these protein, as well as the phospho part of the phospholipid. So these chylomicrons are the biggest ones. This is basically as you digest, you break down fatty acids and lipids, and they pass through in your intestine. They form these chylomicrons before they're secreted into not so much the bloodstream, but the lymphatic system, actually. And this is how they're transported around your body right here, these chylomicrons. So again, this may come up in your digestive lectures. Oh, so here's what I was talking about. Fatty acids, monoglycerides, they're emulsified by bile in your digestive tract, form these little micelles here, and form these chylomicrons, which are going to go, after they're absorbed through the epithelial cells, they go into the underlying area of those epithelial cells and end up in these structure called lacteals, part of the lymphatic system. And that's how lipids basically are transported around. So from the lymphatic system, these chylomicrons make their way back into the blood system and usually stored as triglycerides in the adipose tissue for energy storage. Triglycerides can be used in a couple different ways to eventually make ATP, so that's one of their major functions of lipids, is this energy source. And another major function of lipids is more structural, that is in the makeup of the cell membrane with the phospholipid as well as those cholesterol molecules. And those cholesterol molecules are lipids as steroids. And of course, steroids make up some of the important hormones such as estrogen, testosterone, and others. So that's it for lipids, one of the four major classes of organic macromolecules. In the next section, we'll talk about proteins and nucleotides. See you then.